During the 1800s, Boston was a major city and trading port. It had transformed from being a small and economically inactive town in the late 1700s due to the effects of the British blockade during the Revolutionary War to a bustling seaport and a cosmopolitan center with a large population. Boston was one of the world's wealthiest international trading ports that exported rum, salt, fish, and tobacco, and traded with colonies in Europe and Africa. With many schools, businesses, and an important trading port, the city of Boston was the political, financial, commercial, and religious center of New England. Boston Harbor was the gateway to New England and had a deep natural channel for trading. Because of this deep channel, defending the harbor was a critical strategy of the Union in the Civil War. In the middle of Boston Harbor sat George's Island, midway between the northern and southern arms of the harbor. Because of this strategic location, the Union decided to build a fort on George's Island. It was called Fort Warren, named for Dr. Joseph Warren, a major general of the Massachusetts militia, who sent Paul Revere and William Dawes to alert Lexington and Concord on the night before the Revolution, and later died at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The fort was built in a pentagonal shape on 28 acres of land on the island. The walls of the fort were made from stone and granite that came from quarries in Quincy and Rockport. During the Civil War, the fort never received its full supply of cannons, but on most of the sides of the fort, it was heavily armed with 10 and 15-inch Rodman and coastal cannons. During the Civil War, Fort Warren was used for defense. It was very important for the Union to defend Boston Harbor against enemy ships because it was the only channel deep enough to allow ships to deliver supplies and food to New England. If enemy ships blockaded Boston Harbor, then New England would be cut off and would not be able to get supplies. The Union knew it was crucial to not allow another blockade to occur like the British did during the Revolutionary War, that caused many damaging effects on Boston. Even though it was armed with many cannons, Fort Warren was used for intimidation and a scare tactic to enemy ships, so a shot was never fired from the fort. The fort's main purpose during the war was to be used as a prison for political and military prisoners. In October 1861, 155 political prisoners and over 600 military prisoners captured in the war arrived at Fort Warren. The prisoners were made up of Confederate soldiers, sailors, and political leaders. The prisoners were put into rooms, called casemates, that had a parlor, a kitchen, and bedrooms. Some prisoners were even allowed to drink alcohol and had the freedom to move about the fort during the daytime. Fort Warren even had a hospital and a bakery. More than 2,200 prisoners were imprisoned at Fort Warren, and only 13 prisoners died of disease. The conditions were very good, and the fort was considered a relatively humane facility for Confederate prisoners. The highest-ranking prisoner imprisoned at Fort Warren was Alexander H. Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy during the Civil War. He was held at the fort from May 25th to October 13th, 1865, and wrote a diary about his confinement. On May 28, 1865, Stephens wrote in his diary and described the initial impact of his imprisonment. The horrors of the imprisonment, close confinement, no one to see or talk to, with the reflection of being cut off for I know not how long, and perhaps forever, from communications with dear ones at home, are beyond description. Words utterly fail to express the soul's anguish. The most famous legend about the prison at Fort Warren concerns the Lady in Black. During the Civil War, a young lieutenant was captured and sent to prison at Fort Warren. His wife, living in the South, heard that her husband was captured and secretly arrived at the hull across the harbor from the fort. There she obtained men's clothing and a pistol from a Southerner in the town. On a dark, rainy night, she rowed across the harbor and landed on the beach at George's Island. She quietly slipped past the sentries and reached a ditch under the corridor of dungeons in the fort. She was hoisted up to the carronade embrasure, an opening through which missiles are discharged, and pulled through the opening. As soon as she met her husband, they exchanged greetings and made plans for the future. The prisoners decided they would dig their way out of the dungeon into the parade ground. A slight miscalculation of their plan brought their tunnel to where Union soldiers stationed on the other side of the wall heard them. The scheme was exposed to the colonel, and the lady was cornered. She attempted to fire her pistol at the colonel, but it was old and exploded, killing her husband. The lady was sentenced to be hanged as a spy, and her last request was to be hanged in woman's clothing. After searching the fort, a black robe was found, and the lady went to her death. Through the years, the ghost of the lady in black returned to haunt the men quartered at the fort. Other prisoners held at the fort were the governor of Kentucky, Confederate diplomats James Mason and John Slidell, the Postmaster General John Reagan, major Confederate generals, and many members from the Maryland legislature. The majority of the prisoners were from Maryland because it was very important to keep Maryland in the Union. If Maryland went to the Confederates, then Washington, D.C., the capital, would be surrounded by Confederate territory and be taken over. This would cause the tide of the war to turn in favor of the Confederates, and the Union would soon collapse, causing the Confederates to win the war. The fort was not only used as a prison, but also as a recruiting and training camp for Massachusetts regiments of the Union Army. New infantry recruits were trained and performed marching exercises on the parade ground in the center of the fort before they were sent to fight in the front lines. Fort Warren is a very important place in history and plays a key role in what our country is today. By having a political prison and imprisoning many members of the Maryland legislature, it stopped Maryland from going to the Confederates, which would have caused the Union to collapse, and the Confederates would have won the war. Fort Warren saved the Union without firing a single shot. In this small way, Fort Warren shaped our country to what it is today and contributed to history. According to Edward Rowe Snow, one of the leaders in preserving this historic site, Fort Warren has more memories of the Civil War days than any other place in New England.